Darius Brennan pulled into the parking lot of Riverside Gardens Apartments at 11:43 on a Thursday night, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion settling into him that made 34 feel closer to 50. The dashboard clock glowed green in the darkness, mocking him with another 16-hour shift at Whitmore Industries distribution center. His daughter Riley was sleeping at his sister Simone's place tonight, which meant the apartment would be dark and silent when he walked in. No small voice asking about his day. No stuffed animals scattered across the living room floor. Just him and the leftovers of a life he was too tired to live properly. He climbed the stairs slowly, keys already in hand, muscle memory guiding him to the third-floor unit he'd called home for the past 4 years. The hallway smelled like Mrs. Patterson's cooking from 3C, something with garlic and tomatoes that made his empty stomach clench. He couldn't remember if he'd eaten dinner. Probably grabbed something from the vending machine around 7, maybe 6. The hours blurred together after the first 14. The sound of running water stopped him cold 3 feet from his door. Someone was inside his apartment, inside his kitchen from the sound of it. The rushing water was too steady, too purposeful to be a leaky faucet. Darius's exhaustion evaporated in a spike of adrenaline that tasted like copper on his tongue. His mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Burglars didn't usually stop to do dishes. Drug addicts looking for quick cash didn't run the sink. He pushed the door open slowly, grateful he'd forgotten to lock the deadbolt that morning in his rush to get Riley to school and himself to work. The hinges made no sound. He'd oiled them last month after Riley complained about the squeaking waking her up. His hand found the light switch, and he flipped it without thinking, flooding the small apartment with harsh fluorescent brightness. Evangeline Hart, CEO of Whitmore Industries, stood at his kitchen sink with her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, hands submerged in soapy water, washing a plate that had been sitting in his sink for 3 days. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Darius's brain struggled to process the image in front of him. The woman who ran a $3.2 billion company, whose face appeared in Atlanta Business Chronicle Quarterly, whose signature sat at the bottom of his paychecks, was standing in his cramped kitchen wearing a designer blouse that probably cost more than his monthly rent doing his dishes. The words came out harder than he intended, or maybe exactly as hard as he intended. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" Evangeline turned off the water with deliberate care, dried her hands on the dish towel hanging from his oven door, the one with the faded Georgia Bulldogs logo Riley had picked out at Goodwill. She didn't smile, didn't offer the practiced pleasantries that probably came naturally in boardrooms and investor meetings. When she met his eyes, something in her expression looked raw, unguarded, in a way that didn't match the woman he'd glimpsed twice in company-wide meetings. Her voice came out steady, rehearsed, like she'd been practicing the words while she waited. "I needed to talk to you, and I didn't want it to happen in an office where you'd feel like you couldn't say what you really think." Darius's grip tightened on his keys, the metal biting into his palm. "So you broke into my apartment?" Something that might have been embarrassment flickered across her face. "Your neighbor let me in, Mrs. Patterson. I told her I was a friend from work and that I had something important for you. She seemed happy you had a visitor." A flash of irritation cut through his confusion. Mrs. Patterson was 76 and lonely, and would absolutely let a well-dressed white woman into his apartment if she thought it meant Darius had friends. But the irritation faded fast, replaced by the cold calculation that came from years of navigating spaces where one wrong move could cost everything. He crossed his arms over his chest, still standing in the doorway. "You couldn't have called." The question hung between them. They both knew the answer. A call from the CEO's office would have meant trouble. Darius would have spent every minute before any meeting cataloguing his mistakes, wondering which of his 14-hour days had somehow not been enough, preparing himself for the axe to fall. Better to lose sleep over certainty than speculation, but only barely. Evangeline reached into a leather bag sitting on his kitchen table, the surface scattered with Riley's homework from 2 nights ago, and an empty cereal box he'd meant to throw away. She pulled out a manila folder, the kind that looked ordinary, but somehow carried the weight of the entire room with it. Her words came measured, careful. 3 weeks ago, I started receiving anonymous emails, financial discrepancies in the distribution division. I assumed it was a disgruntled employee making noise, so I handed it to internal audit." She opened the folder, spread several documents across his table, pushing aside a math worksheet Riley had gotten a gold star on, and a grocery list he'd written on the back of an envelope. Darius didn't move to look at them, didn't trust himself to get closer. Every instinct screamed that whatever was in those papers would change things in ways he couldn't predict. Evangeline's voice tightened, and he heard something underneath it that sounded like genuine anger. "What they found made me sick. Richard Caldwell has been running a ghost payroll scheme for the past 18 months. 3 employees who don't exist. Salaries deposited into accounts he controls. $340,000 over 18 months. The number landed like a physical blow, but Darius kept his face neutral. He'd learned early that showing emotion in situations like this was a luxury he couldn't afford. She pulled out another document, this one covered in highlighted numbers. But that's not the worst part. He's been systematically redistributing their workload onto you. Every task, every project, every emergency that should have been handled by a team of 4 has been landing on your desk alone. Something cold and familiar settled in Darius's chest. He heard his own voice distant. I know I work more than the others. That's not news. Evangeline's hands moved to another page, this one a performance review with his name at the top. It's not just the workload. Your performance reviews have been altered, every quarter for the past 2 years. Caldwell has submitted evaluations that keep you exactly 1 point below the threshold for promotion consideration. 8.4 out of 10, every single time. 8.4. She spread out more papers, a timeline that looked like it had been assembled by someone who actually cared about accuracy. Your actual numbers, your efficiency ratings, your error rates, they're exceptional. Top 3% in the company. But on paper, you're perpetually almost good enough. Never quite there. The words landed like blows, each one finding a soft spot in the armor he'd built over the past 2 years. Darius stared at the documents, at the neat columns of numbers that represented his life being stolen from him one spreadsheet at a time. 2 years. 730 days of believing he wasn't quite measuring up. Of pushing harder, sleeping less, missing Riley's school plays and birthday parties because he thought if he just worked a little more, tried a little harder, proved himself a little better, he might finally get ahead. The question came out barely above a whisper. Why me? Evangeline met his eyes, and for the first time he saw something crack in her composure. Because you don't have anyone in your corner. No family connections to the company, no golf buddies in management, no fraternity brothers in HR. She paused, and the pause said everything the words couldn't. And because Caldwell knew that a black man in a department full of white supervisors would have a harder time being believed if he ever complained. He chose you because the system made you vulnerable. He chose you because he thought you wouldn't fight back. Darius sat down heavily in one of his kitchen chairs, the plastic creaking under his weight. His mind catalogued every moment he'd wondered if he was imagining things, every sideways glance in meetings, every promotion that went to someone with half his metrics, every time he'd told himself he was being paranoid, too sensitive reading into things. He'd pushed those thoughts down, worked harder, tried to be better, tried to prove them wrong. They had never intended to let him prove anything. The words came out broken, and he didn't try to hide it. 2 years. I missed 2 years of my daughter's life for this. He thought about Riley's kindergarten graduation that he'd missed because of an emergency shipment. The school play where she'd been flower number 3, and he'd been stuck in a meeting that Caldwell had scheduled at the last minute and then never showed up to. The Saturday mornings when he'd fallen asleep at the kitchen table instead of taking her to the park like he'd promised. Every moment he'd chosen work over her because he thought it mattered, because he thought it would lead somewhere, because he believed the lie that if he just did enough, it would be enough. Evangeline stood motionless across the kitchen, watching him process the destruction of everything he'd believed about his own situation. She didn't offer comfort, didn't move closer. She seemed to understand that nothing she could do in this moment would be welcome or wanted. Darius pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, refusing to let himself fall apart completely. Not in front of her, not in front of anyone. When he finally looked up, his face had hardened into something between rage and exhaustion, the expression of a man who'd been carrying weight for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to put it down. His voice came out flat. Why are you here? Really? You could have sent this through lawyers. Called me into a conference room with HR and a settlement agreement. Why are you standing in my kitchen at midnight? Evangeline was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had lost its corporate polish. Because I built that company from my father's legacy. I told myself I was building something fair, something that rewarded hard work regardless of where someone came from or what they looked like. I believed that because believing it was comfortable. She pulled out the chair across from him, sat down with the kitchen table between them like a negotiating desk. 3 weeks ago, I was reviewing quarterly reports, and I saw a name I didn't recognize in the payroll data, just a name and a salary, one of thousands. When I started pulling threads, your file came up and I saw everything. I saw a single father working hours that should be illegal. I saw a salary that hadn't increased in 2 years, despite department productivity going up 33%. I saw a man being systematically erased while I signed off on reports that told me everything was fine. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed them flat against the table. I could have sent lawyers, could have made this clinical and clean and protected the company's liability exposure, but I didn't want to be protected. I wanted to stand in the place where the damage actually lives and see what my blindness cost. Darius heard the anger creeping back into his voice. So what this is penance, you came to wash my dishes so you could feel better about yourself. The words landed harsher than he'd meant them, but he didn't take them back. Couldn't. 2 years of swallowed frustration and self-doubt were pushing up through his chest, demanding space. Evangeline didn't flinch. I came because I didn't know what else to do. I sat in my car outside your building for 73 minutes trying to figure out the right way to do this, and there is no right way. There's no policy for how to tell someone their life has been stolen. So I came inside and your dishes were in the sink and I started washing them because I needed to do something useful while I waited for you. Something real and small and ordinary. Darius studied her face, looking for the performance, the corporate mask, the calculated sympathy that powerful people deployed when they needed something. He didn't find it. What he found instead was a woman who seemed genuinely shattered by what she'd discovered, and he didn't know what to do with that. Didn't know how to reconcile the CEO who'd missed 2 years of systematic abuse with the person sitting across from him now, hands still damp from his dishwater. Before he could respond, a key turned in the front door. They both went still. The door swung open to reveal Simone carrying Riley on her shoulder, the little girl's arms wrapped loosely around her aunt's neck, eyes closed. Simone stopped dead in the doorway, her gaze snapping from Darius to the stranger at his kitchen table and back again. Simone's voice came out, carefully controlled the tone she used when she was deciding whether to be protective or furious. She threw up at my place, thought she should be home in her own bed. Who's this? Darius stood quickly, moving to take Riley from his sister's arms. The little girl stirred as he lifted her, her eyes fluttering open in that particular way of sick children who didn't want to go back to sleep but desperately needed to. He kept his voice soft. Hey, baby, you're home. Riley's eyes drifted past her father to the woman sitting at their table. Who's that lady? Evangeline rose from her chair, slowly, acutely aware she was intruding on something private. Her voice came out gentler than Darius had heard it. I'm a friend of your father's from work. I was just leaving. But Riley was awake now, that particular alertness of a child who sensed something unusual happening and wanted to be part of it. She squirmed until Darius set her down, then walked over to Evangeline with the fearless curiosity of someone too young to understand the complicated dynamics of adults. Riley looked up at her with open interest. You're pretty. Is that your real hair? Evangeline touched her hair self-consciously, caught off guard. It is. Riley nodded, processing this information with the seriousness of a 7-year-old. I like it. Daddy, can I have water? Simone moved toward the kitchen, still casting suspicious glances at Evangeline, making it clear with her body language that she was staying until she understood what was happening. Darius watched his daughter, who had pulled out a chair and climbed up to sit across from the CEO like they were about to have a business meeting. Riley's next question came out with the simple conviction of absolute truth. Why are you at our house so late? Evangeline glanced at Darius, uncertain. He gave a slight nod, curious to see how she'd handle a 7-year-old's interrogation. She knelt down, so she was at Riley's eye level. I came to talk to your dad about work. Riley's response was immediate and matter-of-fact. Daddy works too much. He's always tired. He falls asleep before the end of movies. Sometimes he forgets to eat dinner because he's still doing work things on his computer. Darius felt his throat tighten. He'd thought he'd hidden it better. Thought Riley was too young to really notice or understand. The guilt that had been sitting at the base of his spine for 2 years suddenly felt heavier. Evangeline's voice stayed gentle. Your daddy is one of the hardest workers at our company. He should have been working less this whole time. I'm trying to fix that. Riley nodded seriously, her expression thoughtful. Good, because I miss him. The words hit the room like a grenade. Simone stopped moving. Darius felt his chest constrict. Evangeline stayed kneeling, her eyes bright, looking at this child who had just articulated what all the spreadsheets and performance reviews could never capture, the human cost of what had been done. Evangeline's words came out quiet, careful. I know you do. And I'm so sorry. Riley tilted her head, considering, why are you sorry Daddy says sorry is for when you did something wrong. The question hung in the air with a child's brutal clarity. Evangeline was quiet for a long moment, and Darius saw something shift in her face, the last wall coming down. She finally said, sometimes people do wrong things without meaning to because they're not paying attention to what's happening around them. And then they have to work really hard to make it right. Riley seemed to consider this, then yawned widely, exhaustion catching up with whatever brief burst of energy had fueled her curiosity. Okay, I'm tired again. Nice to meet you, pretty lady. Darius scooped his daughter up before she could say anything else, grateful for the interruption, even as his mind churned with everything that still needed to be said. He carried Riley toward her bedroom while Simone stayed behind with Evangeline, the silence between them heavy and uncomfortable. When he returned, he found his sister with her arms crossed, protective stance firmly in place, and Evangeline putting on her jacket. She pulled a business card from her pocket, set it on the table with deliberate care. Her words came measured. My personal cell is on the back. Call me when you're ready to talk about next steps. There's no deadline. Take whatever time you need. She moved toward the door, then stopped, turning back to face him directly. For what it's worth, I'm going to do everything in my power to make this right. Not because it's good for the company or because I'm afraid of lawsuits. Because it's what should have happened 2 years ago and I failed you. I failed a lot of people. I won't fail again. She left without waiting for a response. The door clicked shut behind her, and the apartment felt suddenly too quiet, the weight of the conversation settling over everything like dust. Simone turned to Darius with 100 questions in her eyes, but he just shook his head. Later. I'll explain everything later. Right now, I need to sit with Riley until she falls asleep. He walked into his daughter's room, the walls painted in that lavender color she'd picked out 18 months ago, when he'd still believed that working harder would eventually pay off. She was already in bed, curled under her blanket, the stuffed elephant she'd had since she was 3 tucked under her arm. Darius lay down beside her on the small bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every conversation, every moment of the past 2 years through a new lens. Riley shifted against him, her small hand finding his. Her voice came out drowsy. "Daddy." He kept his own voice soft. "Yeah, baby." There was a pause, and then, "I don't think the pretty lady is bad. She seemed sad." Darius closed his eyes. "She is sad." Riley's response was barely a whisper as sleep pulled her under. "Good. Sad means she cares." He didn't answer, just held his daughter and listened to her breathing slow and even, out wondering if caring was enough to fix anything, or if it was just another comfortable lie people told themselves to sleep better at night. The following week existed in a strange suspension. Evangeline had been true to her word about giving him time. No calls from corporate, no emails, no pressure. But the card with her personal number sat on his kitchen counter like a small explosive device waiting to be activated. Darius went to work as usual. Clocked in at 5:30. Started on the mountain of tasks that had somehow become his entire responsibility. But now he saw everything differently. The way Caldwell avoided eye contact when they passed in the hallway. The way his white colleagues seemed to have endless bandwidth for coffee breaks and personal calls while his inbox overflowed. The way no one questioned why one man did the work of 4. It had always been there, but he'd told himself he was imagining it, being paranoid, too sensitive. He wasn't imagining anything. The system had been designed exactly this way, and he'd been too close to see it. On Thursday evening, after another 14-hour shift that left him hollow and angry, he finally called the number on the back of Evangeline's card. She answered on the second ring, her voice careful, like she'd been waiting but didn't want to assume. His words came out more abrupt than he intended. "I want to understand what you're offering. Exactly." They met the next morning at a hotel conference room in downtown Atlanta, neutral territory that belonged to neither of them. Evangeline came alone. No lawyers, no HR representatives, no witnesses to whatever conversation they were about to have. She laid out the proposal in straightforward terms. No corporate softening, no hedging. Senior operations manager. Direct report to the VP of distribution. Salary of $95,000 up from his current $58,000. Back pay for the difference over the past 2 years. $74,000 deposited into his account within 2 weeks. Standard hours, meaning he'd actually get to leave at 5 like everyone else, and a seat at the table when decisions were made. Darius listened to the numbers, the benefits, the promises. It was more than fair. It was generous. It was everything he'd been working toward for years, handed to him on a silver platter wrapped in guilt and corporate liability. He leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "Why does this feel like guilt money?" Evangeline didn't flinch. "Because that's part of what it is. I won't pretend otherwise." He pushed further. "And if I take it, what happens? I become the black guy who got promoted because the CEO felt bad. Every white manager in that building will think I didn't earn it." Something hard flashed across her face. "Some of them will think that, regardless of the circumstances. That's the reality of the system we're operating in." She leaned forward, her voice gaining an edge. "But here's what I know. You've been outperforming everyone in your department for 2 years while carrying 4 times the workload. Your metrics prove it. Your results prove it. The only thing that's been stopping your advancement is deliberate sabotage by someone who should have been protecting your career. This isn't charity. This is correction." Darius was quiet for a long moment, then asked the question that had been eating at him since she'd shown up in his kitchen. Can I ask you something personal? She nodded. His voice came out steady, but the words cost him. If I were white, would any of this have happened to me? Evangeline didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched between them, uncomfortable and necessary. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I've been asking myself that question every day since I found your file, and I think we both know the answer. She met his eyes, directly unflinching. Caldwell chose you because you were vulnerable, because the system made you vulnerable. Because men who look like him have been exploiting men who look like you for generations, and they've gotten away with it because people like me don't look closely enough. Her hands clenched on the table. I can't undo what happened to you. I can't give you back the time you missed with your daughter, or erase the exhaustion and the doubt and the pain. But I can make sure it never happens to anyone else at my company. And I can give you the position you've earned, if you'll take it. Darius looked at the contract in front of him, at the woman across from him who'd broken into his apartment to wash his dishes because she didn't know how else to process her own complicity. He thought about Riley asking when Daddy would be home for dinner. He thought about 2 years of believing he wasn't good enough. He thought about what it would mean to walk into that building as a manager, to sit in meetings with people who would assume he'd been handed something he hadn't earned. And he thought about what it would mean to walk away to let them win, to teach his daughter that fighting back wasn't worth the cost. His voice came out firm. I need to think about it. Evangeline nodded, gathering her papers. Take all the time you need. He thought about it for 3 days. Talked to Simone, who was suspicious but pragmatic. Talked to his pastor, who counseled forgiveness without naivety. Talked to Riley, who just wanted to know if Daddy would be home for dinner more often. On Monday morning, he called Evangeline and accepted the position. The news of Richard Caldwell's termination spread through the distribution center like wildfire. Internal investigation, financial misconduct. The official statement was carefully worded, but everyone knew something bigger was happening. HR called mandatory meetings. Anonymous hotlines were established. Whispers filled every corner about what had really gone down, who had known, who was next. Darius walked into his new office on a Wednesday morning, a real office with a door and a window that looked out over the parking lot, and tried to feel like he belonged there. His first day was a gauntlet of stares and silence. The other managers didn't know how to interact with him. Some were polite to the point of awkwardness. Others made no effort to hide their resentment. He heard the whispers in the break room, caught fragments of conversation that cut off when he walked by. Diversity hire, affirmative action, political correctness, run amok. The words followed him like smoke, impossible to prove, but impossible to ignore. He kept his head down and focused on the work. The numbers didn't lie. The metrics didn't care about the color of his skin. He'd prove himself the way he always had, through results that spoke louder than any of their assumptions. The first person to actually talk to him like a normal human being was Isaiah Turner, one of the warehouse supervisors, a black man in his mid-50s who'd been with the company for longer than Darius had been alive. Isaiah stopped by his office on the 3rd day and closed the door behind him without being invited. His voice came out gentle. You doing okay? Darius shrugged the gesture, saying everything the words couldn't, surviving. Isaiah sat down without asking permission. That's about all any of us have ever done here. He leaned back in the chair, studied Darius with eyes that had seen this story before. I've been watching this company for 28 years. You're the first black man in a management position since Theodore Marshall got pushed out in 2006. Darius felt something cold settle in his stomach. What happened to him? Isaiah smiled without humor. Same thing that almost happened to you, just slower. Death by 1,000 cuts. They didn't need to create ghost employees back then. They just made his life so miserable he quit. Called it a voluntary resignation. The weight of history pressed down on the small office. Darius could see it stretching back years of men who'd fought this same fight, lost in different ways, disappeared into footnotes and forgotten files. He asked the question he wasn't sure he wanted answered. So why do you stay? Isaiah's expression softened. Because somebody has to be here to watch. And because I got 3 kids who needed dental insurance and college funds. You do what you have to do. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. Listen, I'm glad you got this position. You deserve it. But don't think for a second that Evangeline Hart's guilt is going to protect you. The system doesn't change because the CEO has a crisis of conscience. It changes when we make it change, one day at a time, one fight at a time. Darius nodded slowly. I'm not looking for protection. I'm looking to do my job well enough that nobody can question whether I belong here. Isaiah stood up, his smile sad and knowing. Then you're going to have to be twice as good for half the recognition. Same as always. But at least now you'll be in the room where it happens. That's something. Evangeline kept her distance professionally, and Darius couldn't decide if that made things better or worse. She didn't intervene when Doug Patterson made snide comments in team meetings about diversity initiatives, didn't make special appearances to publicly support him, didn't send memos reminding everyone that Darius's promotion was based on merit. She let him sink or swim on his own, which was exactly what he'd wanted, even as part of him resented the isolation. The work itself wasn't the problem. Darius had been doing 4 people's jobs for 2 years. Managing the workload of one felt almost easy by comparison. He reorganized the distribution schedules, streamlined the approval process, identified bottlenecks that had existed so long people thought they were features rather than bugs. Within 2 weeks, his department's efficiency metrics climbed 6%. Within 4, they were up 12. The numbers spoke for themselves, but numbers didn't eat lunch in the break room or make small talk by the coffee machine. Numbers didn't have to navigate the careful choreography of being black in a white workspace, the constant calculation of how much competence was impressive versus threatening, how much friendliness was professional versus too familiar. 3 weeks into his new position, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. He almost deleted it, assuming it was spam, but something made him open it. The message was simple. "How's Riley? Is she feeling better?" He stared at the words for a long moment before he realized who they were from. Evangeline Hart, CEO of a $3.2 billion company, was texting him at 9:30 on a Tuesday night to ask about his daughter's stomach bug from 3 weeks ago. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, uncertain how to respond. Professional distance suggested he shouldn't respond at all, but she'd remembered Riley's name. Remembered she'd been sick. That wasn't nothing. He typed back, "She's fine. Been healthy since that night. Thank you for asking." The response came fast enough to suggest she'd been waiting. "I'm glad. Tell her Eve says hello." Darius set his phone down, unsettled in ways he couldn't quite name. Eve. Riley had called her that because she couldn't pronounce Evangeline, and apparently the CEO of Whitmore Industries had decided to keep the nickname. There was something intimate about that something that crossed lines he wasn't sure should be crossed. More texts followed over the next few days. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing that would raise flags if HR somehow saw them. Just small moments of human connection that felt significant precisely because they were so ordinary. Evangeline asking about his day. Darius sharing something funny Riley had said. Brief exchanges that had nothing to do with work or guilt or the complicated history between them. On a Thursday evening in early March, Evangeline texted asking if he'd had dinner. Before Darius could think better of it, before he could catalogue all the reasons this was a bad idea, he found himself typing, "Making spaghetti with Riley, her favourite. You're welcome to join us if you want." He hit send before he could stop himself, then immediately regretted it. What was he doing? Inviting his CEO to his apartment for dinner crossed so many professional boundaries he couldn't even count them all. She'd probably decline politely cite a prior commitment, and they'd both pretend the invitation had never happened. His phone buzzed 30 seconds later. "I'd love to. What time?" Darius stared at the screen, his stomach doing something complicated. He typed back, 6:30. Her response was immediate. "I'll bring wine." Riley was ecstatic when he told her Eve was coming for dinner, bouncing around the apartment with the kind of energy only 7-year-olds possessed after a full day of school. She insisted on setting the table properly, using the nice plates they usually saved for Thanksgiving, arranging napkins with the precision of someone preparing for visiting royalty. Darius watched his daughter's excitement and felt something twist in his chest. Riley had been quieter since Janelle died, more careful with her affections, slower to trust. Seeing her this animated over a visitor made him realize how small their world had become, how isolated they'd been, just the two of them against everything. Evangeline arrived at 6:28 with a bottle of wine that probably cost more than Darius's weekly grocery budget and a colouring book for Riley. The little girl received both the guest and the gift with enthusiastic approval, immediately pulling Evangeline toward the kitchen table to show her the proper way to colour a princess dress. The evening was strange and ordinary at the same time. A CEO eating supermarket pasta at a folding table in a cramped apartment, while a 7-year-old explained in great detail why purple was objectively the best colour, and anyone who disagreed was simply wrong. Evangeline listened with genuine attention, asked follow-up questions, debated the merits of purple versus blue with the seriousness the conversation deserved. Darius found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't expected, the constant vigilance he maintained at work sliding away as Riley dominated the conversation. His daughter had always been good at reading people sensing when adults were faking interest versus actually engaging. She could tell Evangeline wasn't pretending, and that seemed to matter more than anything else. After Riley went to bed, they sat on the small balcony with their wine glasses watching the parking lot below. The March air was cool, but not cold, carrying the smell of someone's charcoal grill and distant traffic. Evangeline's voice came out softer than usual. "She's wonderful. You've done an amazing job with her." Darius took a sip of wine, letting the compliment settle. "She's the best thing about my life. Everything I do is for her." There was a pause, comfortable in its silence, before Evangeline spoke again. "I never had children. Never found the time, never found the right person. And then suddenly I was 42 and running a company, and it seemed like that window had closed." She turned to look at him, and in the dim light from the kitchen window she seemed younger, somehow less armored. "I used to tell myself I was okay with it, that my legacy would be the business, the jobs I created, the impact I had. And now I'm not sure what any of it means." Darius heard the vulnerability in her words, the admission of something she probably didn't share often. "You've built something significant. That matters." Her laugh was quiet and sad. "I built something that let Richard Caldwell exploit you for 2 years while I signed quarterly reports and congratulated myself on our progressive workplace culture. I spent my whole career trying to prove that a woman could run a company as well as any man, fought for every inch of respect, every promotion, every seat at the table. And in the process I became blind to everyone else fighting battles I'd never have to face." Darius set his wine glass down on the small plastic table between them. "You know what I think about most? It's not the missed time with Riley, though, that hurts. It's the way I felt about myself. For 2 years I believed I wasn't good enough. I believed that no matter how hard I worked, there was something fundamentally lacking in me." He looked out at the parking lot, at the ordinary cars and ordinary lives happening all around them. "Do you know what that does to a person? To wake up every day convinced that your best will never be enough?" Evangeline didn't respond with words. She just listened, giving him space to say things he'd never said out loud, letting the silence hold the weight of what couldn't be articulated. Darius continued the wine and the darkness, making it easier to speak truths he usually kept locked down. "And the worst part is that I can't be sure how much of that doubt was planted by Caldwell's sabotage and how much was already there. Growing up black in America, you learn early that the deck is stacked. You learn to expect less, and then when less is exactly what you get, you can't tell if it's the system or yourself." Evangeline's voice came out barely above a whisper. "I wish I could undo it. All of it." Darius turned to face her. "You can't, but you're trying to do something now, and that matters." They sat in silence for a while, the night sounds of the city filling the space between them. When Evangeline finally left, she hugged him at the door, a brief and careful embrace that somehow felt more significant than any of the professional interactions they'd had. Her perfume was subtle, expensive, completely out of place in his cheap apartment, and yet it didn't feel wrong. Over the following weeks, these evenings became a pattern. Not dates exactly, but something that was building toward meaning. Evangeline attended Riley's school play, cheering louder than any parent when Riley delivered her one line as flower number 3. She helped Darius study for the management certification exam, drilling him on logistics theory and supply chain optimization until his brain hurt. She learned to cook spaghetti the way Riley liked it, with extra parmesan and just enough sauce to coat the noodles but not drown them. Riley started calling her Sophie instead of Eve, unable to quite pronounce the full name, but determined to have something that felt special and hers. Evangeline accepted the new nickname with visible emotion, like being given a gift she hadn't known she wanted. The complications were obvious, even when neither of them spoke about them directly. Evangeline was still his CEO, still the person whose company employed him, still the woman whose guilt had opened doors for him. The power imbalance was impossible to ignore, and beyond that, there was the world outside. A wealthy white woman and a black single father would draw attention, judgment, assumptions about who was using whom and for what. But in Riley's lavender bedroom reading bedtime stories while the little girl insisted Sophie do the funny voices, those complications felt distant and manageable. In the quiet moments on the balcony talking about everything and nothing, the outside world seemed less important than whatever was growing between them. It was Riley, inevitably, who forced the conversation neither adult was ready to have. They were eating dinner, just the two of them, Evangeline having texted earlier that she was stuck in a board meeting. Riley had been quiet through most of the meal, pushing her food around her plate in a way that meant she was thinking hard about something. Finally, she looked up at her father with the direct gaze of someone who'd decided to ask the question regardless of whether it was appropriate. "Daddy, is Sophie your girlfriend?" Darius set down his fork, buying time to formulate an answer that wasn't a lie, but didn't promise more than he could deliver. "Why do you ask, baby?" Riley's response came with the brutal logic of childhood. "Because she comes over a lot, And you smile more when she's here. And I heard Aunt Simone say that you were playing with fire. She frowned, worried. What does that mean? Are you going to get burned out of the mouths of babes? Darius sighed, trying to find words that a 7-year-old could understand. It's complicated, baby. Riley's eyes narrowed, and he recognized his own stubbornness reflected back at him. Why? Because she's your boss, because she's white, and you're black, and people will talk, because you don't know if what you feel is real, or just being grateful to someone who finally saw you, because you're terrified of letting anyone close again after losing Mum. Darius stared at his daughter, wondering when she'd become old enough to see through him so completely. He said none of those things, of course. Instead, he went with the safe answer. Sometimes grown-up feelings take time to figure out. Riley returned to her spaghetti, apparently satisfied. Well, I think you should figure it out soon. I like Sophie. She's nice, and she helps with my homework, and she doesn't treat us like we're different. That night, after Riley was asleep, Darius called Evangeline. His voice came out more serious than he'd intended. We need to talk. In person. She arrived the next evening after Riley was in bed, and they sat on the couch with more space between them than usual, the air heavy with anticipation. Darius didn't waste time with preamble. Riley asked if you were my girlfriend. Evangeline's expression flickered with something he couldn't quite read. What did you tell her? His hands clenched on his knees. That feelings are complicated. That we needed time. She studied his face. Are they complicated? Darius turned to face her, fully needing her to understand. You're my CEO, Evangeline, the woman who discovered I was being exploited and swooped in to fix everything. How am I supposed to know if what I feel for you is real, or just some messed-up gratitude response? The question hung between them, brutal in its honesty. Evangeline's voice came out steady. Is that what you think this is, gratitude? Darius ran a hand over his face. Exhaustion and confusion bleeding into his words. I don't know what this is. That's the problem. And even if it's real, even if this is something genuine growing between us, there's the whole world out there ready to tear it apart. He stood up, needing movement, needing space. People at work will say you promoted me because we're sleeping together. People outside will look at us and see stereotypes instead of people. I've spent my whole life fighting to be seen as more than assumptions, and this would give everyone exactly the story they want to tell. Evangeline reached out and took his hand, her fingers cool against his palm. I've been thinking about the same things. Every logical argument against this, I've made it to myself 100 times. The power dynamics, the optics, the way my board would react. She paused, her grip tightening. But then I think about how I feel when I'm with you and Riley. I think about how this apartment feels more like home than my penthouse ever has. And I wonder if maybe logic isn't the point. Darius looked down at their joined hands, dark skin against pale. What is the point then? Her voice came out firm, certain being honest about what we want. I want you, Darius, not as a project or a penance or a way to assuage my guilt. I want you because you're kind and strong and you make me laugh and you challenge me to be better. I want to be part of your life and Riley's life, in whatever way you'll let me. She stood up, closing the distance between them. And the complications. We face them together, or we don't do this at all. I won't sneak around. I won't pretend in public that you're just an employee. If we do this, we do it in the open. Consequences be damned. Darius was quiet for a long time, processing the weight of what she was offering. The clock on the wall ticked through the silence, marking moments that felt like hours. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. After Janelle died, I never thought I'd feel anything again. I didn't want to. Loving someone and losing them nearly destroyed me. So I closed that part of myself off, poured everything into work and Riley, and convinced myself that was enough. He turned to look at her, really look at her, letting down the walls he'd built so carefully. Meeting you, getting to know you, it's broken something open. I don't know if this will work. I don't know if we can survive everything that's stacked against us, but I know that I feel more alive around you than I have in years, and I'm tired of being afraid. Evangeline's eyes were bright, her voice barely above a whisper. So what do we do? Darius took a breath, committing, I think we start with dinner. A real dinner, at a real restaurant where people can see us together and we figure out the rest as we go. A smile broke across her face, genuine and unguarded. That sounds terrifying. He found himself smiling back. Yeah, it does. When she kissed him, it was soft and tentative and full of promise. The kind of first kiss that acknowledges everything that came before while reaching for what might come after. Darius let himself fall into it, let himself want this, let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, they could build something real out of the wreckage of how they'd started. The complications didn't disappear. If anything, they loomed larger once the decision was made. But for the first time in 3 years, Darius felt like he was moving towards something instead of just surviving. That had to count for something. 6 weeks passed in a careful dance of public and private, professional and personal. At work, they maintained appropriate distance. Evangeline recused herself from any decisions directly affecting Darius's position. She implemented an oversight committee to review all promotions and compensation adjustments in his division. She was meticulous about documentation, about transparency, about ensuring that no one could credibly claim favoritism. Outside of work, they were careful but not secretive. Dinner at restaurants where they might run into colleagues. Riley's soccer games where other parents could see them sitting together. Small acts of normalcy that announced quietly but clearly that this was real. The reactions were exactly as mixed as they'd expected. Some colleagues were supportive in awkward, overly enthusiastic ways that made Darius want to crawl out of his skin. Others were skeptical, whispering just loud enough to be heard. And a few were openly hostile, making comments about diversity initiatives and special treatment that walked right up to the line of HR violations without quite crossing it. Darius had learned to distinguish between the criticism that mattered and the noise that was simply the sound of a changing world encountering resistance. He focused on the work, let his results speak louder than anyone's assumptions, and tried not to let the constant low-level stress grind him down completely. Riley blessedly remained oblivious to most of the adult complications. She was thriving in ways that made Darius's chest tight with gratitude. Sophie came to parent-teacher conferences, helped with science fair projects, taught her how to make scrambled eggs properly, and French braids, and a dozen other small skills that Darius had never quite mastered. On a Saturday morning in late April, they were all in the kitchen together, attempting to make pancakes. Riley was in charge of adding chocolate chips, a responsibility she took very seriously. Evangeline was manning the griddle. Darius was setting the table and trying not to think about how domestic this all felt, how much like the family life he'd thought he'd lost forever. Riley's voice cut through his thoughts. "Sophie, are you going to marry my daddy?" The spatula in Evangeline's hand froze mid-flip. Darius stopped moving entirely. The question hung in the air like smoke impossible to ignore. Evangeline recovered first, her voice gentle. "That's a conversation for another time, sweetheart." Riley nodded seriously, then delivered the follow-up with the casual confidence of someone who'd clearly been thinking about this. "Okay, but if you do, I want to be the flower girl and the ring bearer. I don't see why those have to be separate jobs." Darius couldn't help it. He laughed, the tension breaking like a wave against rocks. Evangeline joined in, and Riley looked pleased with herself, having successfully navigated what she clearly considered a very important negotiation. Later, after Riley was absorbed in a cartoon and they had a moment alone on the balcony, Evangeline brought it up again. "She asked me today if we were going to get married." Darius leaned against the railing, looking out at the parking lot that had become the backdrop for so many important conversations. "What would you tell her if she asked you?" Evangeline was quiet for a moment, considering. "I'd tell her that when you find someone who sees you, really sees you, the whole you with all your complications and history and struggles, you hold on to that person, because being truly seen is the rarest gift anyone can give." She turned to face him. "Even if it's complicated, especially then." Darius reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "My pastor says love is a choice you make every day. Not just a feeling, but an action. A commitment to keep choosing someone even when it would be easier not to." Evangeline squeezed his hand. "Then I choose this. I choose you. I choose Riley. Every day for as long as you'll let me." The words settled between them, not quite a proposal, but something close. A promise. A foundation to build on. Inside, Riley called out that her cartoon was over and she wanted to play a board game. Evangeline and Darius exchanged a look, a whole conversation happening in silence before heading inside to where Riley had already set up Candyland on the coffee table. This was their life now. Pancakes and cartoons and board games. Late-night conversations and early morning coffee. The ordinary magic of showing up for each other day after day in all the small ways that added up to something significant. The world outside would keep turning, keep judging, keep throwing obstacles in their path. But here in this moment, in this cramped apartment that had become home for all three of them, they had something that felt unshakable. Darius had spent 2 years invisible, erased by a system designed to exploit his vulnerability. He'd spent 3 years before that drowning in grief, convinced he'd never find his way back to anything resembling happiness. Now watching Evangeline let Riley cheat shamelessly at Candyland while pretending not to notice, he understood that sometimes the most profound changes came not from grand gestures, but from small, consistent acts of love, from being seen, from choosing to see someone else in return, from building a home out of broken pieces and calling it whole. The email arrived on a Thursday evening in early May, just as Darius was packing up to leave the office at a reasonable hour for the first time that week. The sender was anonymous, routed through some untraceable service that set off immediate alarm bells. The subject line read simply, "Interesting relationship." His finger hovered over the delete button for a full 10 seconds before curiosity won out. He clicked. The email contained no text, just attachments. 6 photographs, each one time-stamped and geotagged with professional precision. Evangeline and Riley at the park on April 28th, laughing over ice cream cones. Evangeline leaving his apartment building on 3 separate occasions, times clearly visible. Evangeline and Darius on his balcony, the angle suggesting someone had been watching from the parking lot with a telephoto lens. And then the last 2 images, the ones that made his blood run cold. Riley alone with Evangeline at the public library, sitting close together over a picture book. The caption underneath read, "White CEO grooming black child," or just inappropriate relationship with employee's daughter. Darius's hands started shaking. He forced himself to breathe, to think, to not let the panic overwhelm him completely. This was calculated. Whoever sent this knew exactly what buttons to push, what narrative would do the most damage. A second email arrived at 7:03, this one with text. "Ms. Hart has developed quite the attachment to her employee and his child. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution would find this very interesting, especially the timeline." Did the promotion come before or after the relationship? Did she use company resources to investigate an employee she was personally interested in? Withdraw Mr. Brennan's promotion by tomorrow at 8 a.m. Or these photos go public. You have 12 hours. Darius felt the world tilt sideways. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about Riley. They were willing to drag a 7-year-old child into their revenge scheme to paint her relationship with Evangeline as something twisted and wrong. The thought made him physically ill. For a black man, accusations involving white women and children carried a weight that never quite left the cultural consciousness. It didn't matter that the truth was innocent. It didn't matter that every interaction had been appropriate. The mere suggestion, the shadow of impropriety, could destroy everything he'd built, could cost him his job, could cost him custody of Riley if they pushed hard enough, if they painted him as someone who'd allowed his daughter to be exploited for career advancement. Richard Caldwell knew exactly what weapon would cut deepest, and he was wielding it with surgical precision. Darius's first instinct was to call Evangeline, but his hand froze over the phone. If they were being watched, if calls were being monitored, that would only give them more ammunition. Instead, he forwarded the emails to his personal account, cleared his browser history, and walked out of the office like nothing was wrong. The drive home took 23 minutes through Atlanta traffic, and every second of it Darius spent running scenarios. He could accept the demotion, go back to being invisible, protect Riley from being dragged through the media. That was the safe play, the smart play. But it was also surrender. It was teaching his daughter that fighting back wasn't worth the cost, that powerful people always won, that justice was a fairy tale for those naive enough to believe the system could change. He'd spent 2 years being ground down by a system designed to exploit him. He'd swallowed his pride, questioned his worth, believed the lies they'd fed him about his own inadequacy. And when the truth finally came out, when he'd been given a chance to stand up and claim what he'd earned, he'd taken it despite knowing the cost. Now they wanted him to give it all back, to prove they'd been right about him all along. Riley was already home when he arrived, Simone having picked her up from after-school care. His daughter was at the kitchen table working on homework, tongue poking out in concentration the way it always did when she was tackling something difficult. She looked up when he walked in, her face lighting up with the uncomplicated joy of a child who still believed her father could fix anything. Simone caught his expression and knew immediately something was wrong. She made an excuse about needing to check something in the hallway, giving him a meaningful look that said they'd talk later. Darius appreciated the discretion, even as he dreaded the conversation. He sat down across from Riley, watching her fill in spelling words with careful attention to staying inside the lines. She'd grown so much in the past few months, smiled more, laughed easier, stopped flinching at every unexpected noise. Evangeline had been part of that healing, giving Riley a maternal figure who showed up consistently, who didn't demand anything in return, who just loved her for exactly who she was. And now, someone wanted to weaponize that love, turn it into something ugly and suspicious. Riley looked up from her homework. "Is Sophie coming for dinner tonight?" The question was innocent, hopeful, completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding around them. Darius felt his throat tighten. "Not tonight, baby. She's got meetings." Riley accepted this with a small nod, returning to her spelling. But then she paused, her child's intuition picking up on something wrong. "Daddy, are you okay? You look sad." He forced a smile that felt like broken glass. "Just tired from work. Nothing for you to worry about." But Riley knew him too well. She set down her pencil and came around the table, climbing into his lap, like she used to do when she was smaller. She wrapped her small arms around his neck and whispered, "It's okay to be sad sometimes. Sophie says feelings are meant to be felt, not hidden." Darius held his daughter close, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo, and felt something crack open in his chest. This child, this perfect, wise, beautiful child, deserved better than a father who taught her that hiding was safer than fighting. He called Evangeline at 7:30 after Riley was in bed. His voice came out harder than he intended. "We have a problem. You need to come over. Now." She arrived 27 minutes later, her face tight with concern. Darius handed her his phone with the emails already pulled up, watched her expression shift from confusion to horror to cold fury as she read through them. Her voice shook when she finally spoke. "They're using Riley. They're going to hurt a child to get to us." Darius took the phone back. "They're going to do more than that. If this goes public, I lose everything. My job, my reputation, possibly even custody. One accusation, one hint that I allowed my daughter to be used for my career advancement and child services gets involved." He started pacing, unable to stand still. "You don't understand what this means. You're a white woman with money and power. When scandal hits you, you hire good lawyers and weather the storm. When it hits me, when accusations involve you and my daughter, the system assumes guilt. I don't get the benefit of the doubt. I don't get to fight back. I get destroyed." Evangeline went pale, and he saw the moment she truly understood. Not intellectually, not theoretically, but in her bones. The privilege of never having to think about these dynamics of moving through the world, assuming fairness and process, crashed against the reality of what Darius faced every single day. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "What do we do?" Darius stopped pacing. "You accept their terms. You withdraw the promotion. We stop seeing each other. You stay away from Riley. We give them exactly what they want." The words tasted like ash, but he forced them out anyway. This was the only path forward that kept Riley safe, and her safety mattered more than his pride, more than justice, more than anything. Evangeline shook her head violently. "No, absolutely not. We fight this. We go public ourselves, control the narrative, show them we have nothing to hide." Darius cut her off, his voice rising. "With what? The truth. You think the truth matters? They'll spin it any way they want. CEO develops inappropriate interest in subordinate, uses company resources to investigate him, promotes him after starting a relationship, gains access to his vulnerable child. Every fact they have is technically accurate. The interpretation is what kills us." He moved closer, needing her to really hear him. "And even if we somehow win in the court of public opinion, even if we prove we did nothing wrong, the damage is done. Riley becomes the black girl whose father used her to sleep his way to the top. She carries that for the rest of her life. Kids at school, teachers who look at her differently, a Google search that follows her forever." Evangeline's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "So, we just surrender, let them win?" The question hung between them, heavy with everything they stood to lose. Darius's voice came out flat, defeated. "You stay away. That's the only way to protect her. I can survive losing a promotion. I can't survive losing my daughter." Evangeline reached for him, but he stepped back, needing the distance. "Please, just go. This was a mistake from the beginning. We both knew it." She looked like he'd struck her. "You don't mean that." But he forced himself to meet her eyes to make his voice cold. "I do. You need to leave, and you can't come back." The silence stretched between them, breaking something that had barely begun to heal. Finally, Evangeline gathered her things with shaking hands and walked to the door. She paused there, her back to him, and he heard her voice crack. "I'm so sorry. For all of it." Then she was gone, and Darius was alone in his apartment, the weight of protection and surrender pressing down on his chest like a stone. He didn't sleep that night. Just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, running through scenarios, hating himself and the system, and Richard Caldwell with equal measure. Around 3 a.m., he heard Riley's door creak open. Small footsteps padded down the hallway, and then she was standing in his doorway, backlit by the nightlight. Her voice came out small and frightened. "I had a bad dream." Darius opened his arms, and she climbed into bed with him, burrowing against his side. They lay there in the darkness, and he wondered how much she'd heard through the thin walls, how much she understood about the adult complications tearing their small family apart. Riley's voice was sleepy when she finally spoke. "Is Sophie not coming back?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He tried to keep his voice steady. "She's very busy, baby. Work stuff." Riley was quiet for a long moment, and he thought maybe she'd fallen asleep. Then, "You're lying again. You said you wouldn't lie to me anymore." Darius closed his eyes, hating that his daughter could read him so easily. "It's complicated." She shifted to look up at him in the darkness. "Did someone say bad things about us, about Sophie being here?" His breath caught. How did she know? How much did children pick up that adults thought they missed? Riley continued, her voice matter-of-fact. "Mia at school said her mom said it's weird that a rich white lady comes to our house all the time. She said we're probably taking advantage, that you're probably using me to get money from Sophie." Darius felt rage flood through him, hot and immediate. Some woman he'd never met had said that to her child, who'd then repeated it to Riley, and now his 7-year-old daughter was processing adult ugliness she shouldn't have to understand for decades. His voice came out tight. "That's not true. You know that's not true." Riley nodded against his chest. "I know. But I also know you're scared. You're always telling me to do what's right even when it's scary. But now you're pushing Sophie away. That doesn't feel right, Daddy. It feels scared." The wisdom of children cutting through complexity to find the simple truth underneath. Darius had spent hours convincing himself that pushing Evangeline away was protection, was the responsible choice, was the only option. His 7-year-old daughter saw through it in seconds. Riley's next words were barely a whisper. "Sophie promised me she wouldn't leave. When I was sick that night, she promised. Sophie doesn't break promises, so why are you making her break it?" The question landed like a hammer blow. Darius had spent the evening making a decision for everyone involved, assuming he knew what was best, taking away everyone else's choice in the name of protection. But maybe protection wasn't what Riley needed. Maybe what she needed was to see her father fight for something worth fighting for. He held his daughter close and didn't answer, because he didn't have an answer that made sense anymore. They lay together in the darkness, and somewhere around 4:30, Riley's breathing evened out into sleep. Darius stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the careful walls he'd built around his heart crack under the weight of a child's faith that the world could be better than it was. Friday morning arrived, grey and overcast, threatening rain that matched Darius's mood. He got Riley ready for school on autopilot, packing her lunch, checking her homework folder, braiding her hair the way Evangeline had taught him. Every small task felt like moving through water, exhausting and surreal. He was making coffee when someone knocked on the door at 7:45. Too early for visitors. His heart rate spiked, wondering if someone had decided not to wait until 8 a.m. if the journalists were already here. But when he opened the door, Evangeline stood there with 2 other people. A woman in her late 50s, wearing an expensive suit, and a man around 45 carrying a leather briefcase that screamed, "Lawyer." Evangeline's voice was steady, determined. "I know what you said last night. I'm asking you to hear me out anyway." Darius glanced back at Riley, who was thankfully absorbed in her cereal. He stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind him. Evangeline gestured to her companions. "This is Margaret Ashford, my attorney, and David Kane, a private investigator. I've spent the past 6 hours not sleeping and instead building a case." She pulled a folder from her bag, this one significantly thicker than the manila envelope from that first night. "We know who sent the emails. Richard Caldwell is working with Gregory Whitmore, the CFO, who retired 6 months ago. They've been planning this since Caldwell was terminated. The goal was to destroy both of us if they were caught." David Kane spoke up, his voice professional and calm. "They made several mistakes. The photos were taken from public spaces, which is legal, but the email routing went through a server that Mr. Caldwell has used before for other questionable communications. We can trace it definitively." Margaret Ashford opened her briefcase. "More importantly, we've documented everything. Your entire relationship timeline, every text message with timestamps, every public appearance. Riley's school records showing Ms. Hart volunteered as a guest reader 6 times, always with other parents present. Photos from family dinners that Mr. Brennan explicitly consented to." She pulled out another document. "We also have bank records proving Ms. Hart has never given you money. No gifts of significant value. No financial entanglement beyond her paying for occasional meals, which we have receipts for. Everything documented, everything transparent." Evangeline's voice gained strength. "If they want to fight us with innuendo, we fight back with evidence. If they want to make this public, We go public first on our terms with the full truth. We don't hide. We don't surrender. We show them that we have nothing to be ashamed of. Darius felt something shifting in his chest, fear giving way to something that might have been hope. And Riley. How do we protect her from being dragged through this? Margaret's expression softened. We keep her name out of it entirely. In any public statement, she's referred to only as your daughter. No photos, no identifying information. We make it clear that any media outlet that publishes information about a minor child will face immediate legal action. She leaned forward. Mr. Brennan, I've been practicing law for 32 years. I've seen this play before. Powerful men who think they can weaponize the system against those with less power. Sometimes they win because their targets are too afraid to fight back. But when someone stands up with the truth fully documented and transparently presented, the power dynamic shifts. David Kane added, We've also found evidence that Caldwell and Whitmore were planning to leak false information to Child Protective Services, anonymous reports questioning your fitness as a parent. That's a felony. They were willing to risk criminal charges to destroy you. The rage Darius had been holding back surged forward. They were going to try to take my daughter. Evangeline's voice cracked. I know. And that's why we're not backing down. Because this isn't just about a promotion or a relationship anymore. This is about stopping people who are willing to hurt a child to protect themselves. She pulled out her phone. I've drafted a statement. It goes to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution at 8:15, along with full documentation of Caldwell's fraud, the timeline of our relationship, and evidence of this extortion attempt. We control the narrative. We tell the truth before they can tell their lies. Darius stared at the woman in front of him, this CEO who'd broken into his apartment to wash his dishes because she didn't know how else to face her own complicity, who'd spent the night fighting for him instead of protecting herself, who was willing to risk her reputation, her company, everything because a 7-year-old girl had made her promise not to leave. He thought about what Riley had said, about doing what's right even when it's scary, about not breaking promises, about fighting instead of hiding. His voice came out rough. If we do this, there's no going back. Whatever happens next, we're in it together. Evangeline met his eyes. I don't want to go back. I want to go forward. With you. With Riley.
Whatever that looks like.
The door behind Darius opened, and Riley poked her head out, clearly having heard voices. Sophie, you came back. She threw herself at Evangeline, who caught her and lifted her up, holding her tight. Riley pulled back to look at her seriously. You didn't break your promise. Evangeline's voice was thick. I never will, sweetheart. I promise. Riley nodded, satisfied, then looked at her father. Are we doing the scary thing, or the hiding thing? Out of the mouths of babes. Darius looked at his daughter, at Evangeline, at the lawyers who'd spent the night building armor out of truth. He thought about Theodore Marshall, who'd been pushed out in 2006, about all the men before him who'd fought and lost, about Isaiah Turner still watching after 28 years because someone had to bear witness. His voice came out steady. We're doing the scary thing. Riley pumped her fist in victory, and Evangeline laughed through tears, and Margaret Ashford smiled like a general who'd just been given permission to unleash her best strategy. At 8:17 a.m., the Atlanta Journal-Constitution received a comprehensive press release from Evangeline Hart, CEO of Whitmore Industries. It detailed Richard Caldwell's fraud scheme, the systematic exploitation of Darius Brennan, the discovery of the abuse, and the subsequent promotion based on merit. It acknowledged transparently and without apology that Hart and Brennan had developed a personal relationship months after the professional situation was resolved. It included documentation of an extortion attempt using photos taken of them in public spaces. And it announced that Whitmore Industries would be implementing comprehensive reforms to prevent future abuse, including independent oversight of all promotions, mandatory bias training, and a third-party hotline for reporting discrimination. The statement ended with a line that would be quoted in business ethics classes for years. When systems fail, people leaders have two choices: hide from the damage or stand in it and commit to change. I choose to stand. By 9 a.m., the story was everywhere. Local news picked it up first, then regional, then national business outlets. The narrative split predictably along partisan lines, but the weight of documentation made it hard to dismiss entirely. Photos of Darius's performance metrics over 2 years, the ghost payroll evidence, the altered reviews, the timeline showing the relationship began after his promotion, the text messages between Caldwell and Whitmore plotting their revenge. The court of public opinion was messy and complicated, but the court of law was clearer. By noon, the FBI had opened an investigation into Caldwell and Whitmore for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. By 2 p.m., both men had been arrested. Darius watched it unfold from his office, where he'd insisted on going despite everyone telling him to stay home. He needed to be here. Needed to show his face. Needed to demonstrate that he wasn't hiding, wasn't ashamed, wasn't backing down. His co-workers didn't know how to react. Some avoided him entirely. Others offered awkward words of support. Doug Patterson, who'd made snide comments for weeks, actually apologized, his face red with embarrassment. Isaiah Turner stopped by at 3 p.m., closed the door, and sat down without being invited. He was quiet for a long moment, just studying Darius's face. Finally, he spoke. "Theodore Marshall called me this morning. First time I've talked to him in 18 years. He read the news. He wanted me to tell you something." Isaiah leaned forward. "He said he wished he'd had what you have. Not the evidence or the lawyers or the CEO in his corner. He wished he'd had the courage to fight instead of quietly disappearing. He said you did what he couldn't and he's proud of you." Darius felt his throat tighten. "I almost didn't. I almost gave them exactly what they wanted." Isaiah smiled, sad and knowing. "But you didn't. That's what matters. You chose the scary thing." The reference to Riley's words made Darius laugh despite everything. His daughter had somehow become the moral compass for all of them, cutting through adult complexity with childish clarity. A knock on the door interrupted them. Evangeline stood there looking exhausted and determined in equal measure. Isaiah stood up, nodded to both of them, and left, closing the door behind him. Evangeline's voice came out uncertain. "I know you're working. I can come back." Darius cut her off. "No, stay, please." She sat down in the chair Isaiah had vacated, and they looked at each other across his desk, all the professional barriers and power dynamics suddenly seeming irrelevant in the face of what they'd just survived together. Darius spoke first. "Thank you for not giving up, for fighting." Evangeline shook her head. "You don't need to thank me. I should have fought harder 2 years ago. Should have been paying attention. Should have—" He cut her off gently. "We can't change the past. We can only decide what we do with now." She nodded, accepting the wisdom in that. "So what do we do with now?" Darius considered the question. Outside his office window, the distribution center continued its work. Forklifts moved pallets, workers loaded trucks. The ordinary machinery of commerce ground forward, indifferent to the personal dramas playing out within it. His voice came out thoughtful. "I think we keep doing what we've been doing. Work, family, dinner together when we can. We don't hide, but we don't perform either. We just live our lives and let people make of it what they will." Evangeline smiled, real and warm. "That sounds perfect." A pause. Then, "Riley wants to know if you're coming to dinner tonight. She's been planning the menu since she got home from school. Apparently we're having spaghetti and chocolate chip cookies and apple juice because that's what she considers a balanced meal." Evangeline's laugh was bright and genuine. "I wouldn't miss it for anything." 6 months passed with the strange compression of time that comes after crisis. The media attention faded as new scandals emerged to capture public interest. Caldwell and Whitmore's trial was scheduled for the following spring. Whitmore Industries implemented its promised reforms, and Evangeline personally oversaw every change. In August, she announced she was transitioning from CEO to strategic advisor. The decision shocked the board, but she was firm. Thomas Whitmore, the HR director who'd supported Darius from the beginning, was promoted to CEO. Evangeline would remain a major shareholder and provide guidance, but she would no longer have direct power over daily operations. When asked why, she gave a simple answer: "I can't be in a healthy relationship with someone who works for my company, so I'm choosing the relationship." Darius was promoted to VP of Operations in October under the new CEO, based on 6 months of exceptional performance metrics that no one could credibly dispute. The whispers hadn't stopped entirely, but they'd quieted. His results spoke for themselves. Riley thrived. She'd grown another inch, lost 2 more teeth, and developed strong opinions about everything from climate change to the appropriate amount of cheese on pizza. She called Evangeline Sophie without self-consciousness, introduced her to friends as her dad's girlfriend, and seemed utterly unbothered by the complications that still sometimes kept the adults awake at night. On a cool evening in December, they were in the kitchen together, all 3 of them attempting to make Christmas cookies. Riley was in charge of decorating, which meant half the frosting ended up on her face, and the cookies looked like abstract art. Evangeline was monitoring the oven after the first batch had gotten slightly too brown. Darius was washing dishes as they accumulated, a task that had taken on new meaning since that first night. Riley's voice cut through the comfortable chaos. "Sophie, are you staying for Christmas morning?" Evangeline glanced at Darius, uncertain. They'd been together for 8 months now, but Christmas morning felt significant, like crossing a threshold they hadn't explicitly discussed. Darius met her eyes and nodded slightly. "This is your home too now. You don't need to ask permission. Riley beamed, already planning. Okay, so we need to get you a stocking, and we need to make extra cookies for Santa because he comes to all our houses. And she continued planning with the seriousness of a military strategist, while the adults exchanged looks that said everything words couldn't. This was their life now, messy and imperfect, and more real than anything either of them had experienced before. Later, after Riley was in bed, and they sat on the balcony watching their breath fog in the cold air, Evangeline brought up something she'd been thinking about. "I've been looking at houses." Darius raised an eyebrow. "Yeah." She pulled out her phone, showed him listings. 3 bedrooms. Good school district. Backyard for Riley. Close enough that you could still get to work easily, but more space than this apartment. He studied the pictures, something complicated happening in his chest. "These are expensive." Evangeline's voice was careful. "I know. I'm not suggesting I buy something for you. I'm suggesting we look at what we could afford together. As partners, equal investment, equal ownership." The offer was generous and terrifying in equal measure. Moving in together was a statement, a commitment, a promise that this wasn't temporary or convenient, but real and lasting. Darius thought about his daughter sleeping in her lavender bedroom, the walls covered with drawings of 3 people holding hands. He thought about Evangeline teaching Riley to make French braids and scrambled eggs. He thought about coming home to find them already there, waiting for him, making the apartment feel less like survival and more like life. His voice came out steady. "I think Riley would love having a backyard." Evangeline's smile was bright enough to light up the dark. "Is that a yes?" He took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "That's a yes to looking, to seeing what's possible, to taking the next step together." She kissed him soft and sweet and full of promise, and Darius let himself believe that maybe finally the hard part was behind them, that they could just be a family now, ordinary and complicated and beautifully imperfect. From inside the apartment, Riley's voice called out, "Daddy! Sophie! Can someone bring me water?" They looked at each other and stood at the same time, the choreography already familiar. 2 sets of footsteps moving through the small apartment that had become home for all of them. The lavender walls that Darius had painted with desperate hope now held Riley's drawings, visible proof of how their family had grown and changed. Evangeline got the water while Darius tucked the blankets around Riley. His daughter's eyes were already heavy with sleep, but she smiled up at them both. "I'm glad Sophie's staying for Christmas." Her voice dropped to a whisper like she was sharing a secret. "I'm glad she's staying for everything." Evangeline sat on the edge of the bed, brushing hair back from Riley's forehead. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." Riley's eyes drifted closed, and they sat there for a moment longer, watching her breathe this child who'd somehow become the center of gravity for both of them. When they finally stood to leave, Darius looked back one more time at his daughter, safe and loved, and certain of her place in the world. They returned to the kitchen, and Evangeline automatically started washing the last of the cookie sheets. Darius picked up a dish towel, falling into the rhythm they'd developed over months of shared domesticity. The water ran, the dishes clinked. Outside, the world continued with all its complications and injustices and possibilities. But in this small kitchen, in this imperfect apartment, something had been built that mattered. Not just a relationship or a family, but a testament to the idea that justice wasn't only about punishing the guilty or correcting the record. It was about creating space for people to be valued for who they truly were. About having someone in your corner who would fight for you and with you even when the battle seemed endless. Darius had spent 2 years being invisible, exploited, convinced of his own inadequacy. He'd questioned his worth every single day. He'd believed the lie that he simply wasn't enough. Now, drying dishes beside the woman he loved while his daughter slept peacefully down the hall, he finally understood what enough actually meant. It meant this, exactly this. Nothing more required. Not perfect, not without struggle, but real and solid and worth fighting for. Evangeline set down the last dish and dried her hands, then turned to face him. Her expression was serious, vulnerable, in a way that still surprised him. "I need to tell you something." Darius set down his towel, giving her his full attention. She took a breath. "Before I met you, I thought I had everything figured out. Thought success meant quarterly earnings and market share and legacy. I built an empire and convinced myself that was enough, that I didn't need anything else." Her voice softened. "And then I stood in your kitchen at midnight and you looked at me like I was completely insane for washing your dishes. And Riley asked me why I was sad. And I realized I'd been living half a life, calling it whole." She reached for his hands. "I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if we'll find the perfect house, or if Riley will always be this accepting, or if the world will stop judging us for not fitting into neat categories. But I know that I'm more myself with you than I've ever been with anyone. I know that coming home to this apartment feels more real than anything I've accomplished in a boardroom, and I know that I want to keep choosing this, choosing you, choosing us for as long as you'll have me." Darius pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. When you find someone who truly sees you, not the performance or the protection or the armor, but the actual person underneath you, don't let that go. You fight for it, even when it's scary, especially then. They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other while the city hummed around them. Two people from different worlds who'd found their way to each other through circumstances neither could have predicted. The future was uncertain, as it always was. But for now, there was a home that had transformed from a place of exhaustion into something warm and alive. A child who was flourishing, secure in the knowledge that she was loved. A relationship built on truth, however painful its origins, and the hard-won understanding that sometimes the most profound victories weren't about changing the entire system, but about refusing to let it define your worth. Darius Brennan had spent 2 years invisible. Now he was seen.
Now he was valued, now he was home, and that finally was enough.